My name is Mo. For the past couple years, I've been working on a community-generated set of ethical principles, working with technologists and tech-adjacent people, so doing a lot of kind of community moderation. Today, I'm joined by people that know way more about content moderation than I do and have tons of different perspectives. One thing I want to frame this conversation with is to invite the audience into thinking about our own role in online spaces and the generation of content. Who here tweets? Who here writes blog posts? Does anybody here, for instance, write for a journalistic platform like the New York Times? Awesome. Consider for a minute different ways that when you write a tweet or write a journalistic piece, how you may self-regulate or consider your audience. As we produce content, there's lots of factors going into the ways we want to interact with the world. And I think it's interesting to consider our own role in that as we look at different ways that content moderation and hate speech and different ways of communicating online actually interact with our individual selves. With that, I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves and a couple lines about them. Feel free to share something fun about yourself too, because it is a mid-afternoon panel. And I know we've all had lunch, we've all heard a bunch of interesting thoughts, but we're also here to have fun, interact, and be in community too.
So my name is Matt Soeth, co-founder #ICanHelp. Before becoming the co-founder executive director of that nonprofit, I was an educator, administrator from the education world, a lot of teacher development. It was funny, I actually took my kids to a leadership conference, and as they walk in, the speaker did the same thing. If you hear me clap once, hear me clap twice. And one of my students got this big look on her face. She's just, I'm like, what is it? She's like, they do that too. And so I love kind of like that youthful innocence and that connection of like, oh my gosh, like this, there's more of a global thing. So I always think about that when that stuff happens. But we got involved 6 years ago or so. We had an incident on our campus where someone made a fake Facebook page about a teacher, a lot of drama, over 1,000 followers. About 2 weeks before the page got taken down, student found out who made it, turned the person into the principal. They took the page down. A year later, we had a fake Instagram page made about the same teacher. This time the page had 0 followers. We had over 40 students go online, comment in support of the teacher. The page was taken down in less than 45 minutes. And so kind of our initial inception was, how do we train students particularly, but the user, to kind of not only understand the tools, understand how those tools work, how to apply them, and even how to respond to this negative content was kind of our first introduction into this content moderation world, and really helping them to sort of build up those systems and procedures to be able to handle all that stuff.
Hi guys, my name is Zineb Laraki. I also go by Z. I work on product at Salesforce, specifically on AI products. So half my team is the AI research team. So they're literally advancing the state of the art in computer vision, NLP, publishing papers. And then the other half of my team is working on taking these latest and greatest innovations and bringing them to market. And so with this also comes a lot of great responsibility, right? We're democratizing AI, making it accessible to our customers. But that also means we want to make sure that we're training and educating them to use these tools properly. And so ethics is kind of a big part of what we do there.
Hey guys, my name is Justin Davis. I'm the CEO of Spectrum Labs. I've spent the last, may not look it, but last 16 years in data and technology. The latest company, Spectrum Labs, we work with basically the largest social networks, dating apps, gaming companies, marketplaces to help them identify the really nasty stuff that happens on their sites. So everything from human trafficking, terrorism plots, sexual harassment, hate speech, self-harm, and all sorts of other behaviors.
Thank you. As you can see, we have people that are working on the hate speech and content moderation everywhere from training individuals to deploying AI to kind of address some of these emergent concerns in technology. I'd like to start by kind of referencing some of the updates of content moderation or innovations in content moderation policy that have come out this week, because different platforms, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, have started experimenting with different rules. For instance, Reddit provides a set of standard rules such as no sexual harassment, no manipulation or upvoting, but then each community gets to set additional guidelines. Twitter released a new tool this week that was mentioned in the digital civility block that allows users to block individual replies and actually remove them from their post. Do each of you, and then Facebook with their Supreme Court, which is kind of an interesting, I think, experiment in a platform actually being a country, which was also referenced quite playfully by earlier today by the Center for Unintended Technology. How do each of you view the future of content moderation? Should each policy be determined by each platform? Could there even be a global rules of engagement? And then this one is a little bit more for you, Justin. How do you deploy AI on such a checkered landscape? So any of you feel free to jump in.
I love how he looks right at me. I think it's hard because the no matter how many rules and for content moderation policy and other stuff, those are very hard conversations. There's still that human aspect, right? And with kids, as an example, like, all right, well, you can remove comments. What we learn from working with young people is most of them won't block someone who's harassing them, or they won't report it because then A, they're afraid nothing's going to happen. So that's one issue that schools deal with. And then B, well, if I block this person and they're talking about me, then I won't know what they're saying. And if they're talking about me, I want to know what it is. And so we can create whatever rules and policies around content moderation that we want, but there's still that human social element where kids are trying to understand and navigate this world of relationships and what they can do with it, good or bad. That whatever rules you put in place, kind of educating them on how to manage those relationship nuances.
Awesome. I think that's interesting too, with the placing the burden on the person who's actually being harassed, and that might be something we come with later.
Yeah, back to your first question around a global set of standards that could potentially govern how social platforms work as it relates to trust and safety and toxicity. I think the main question there would be who's on that panel, like who's making that rules. Is it policy driven from politicians? That would scare the crap out of me, I think. If it's the large social networks, it depends who from those companies is actually having a seat at that table. Is it some executive C-level individual, or is it someone from policy or trust and safety or the moderators themselves? So it gets really difficult. And then if you think about how every social platform is governed, or what what service they're trying to deliver for each individual, whether it's a marketplace, a user review company, a dating app, a gaming company, it's very difficult to come up with one set of policies that would apply to all of them in some manner that wouldn't negatively impact their user base. So then it comes down to each brand themselves or each platform trying to come up with policies that work for them. and then that's problematic from an AI standpoint, right? Because then you're saying that each platform themselves that wants to solve for hate speech or self-harm, they then have to roll out some mechanism to detect this, whether it's a massive staff of people and moderators, or deploy technology like AI or keyword detection systems that can detect this stuff. And that's problematic as well, especially when you think about the resources that are required to do that. Facebook and these kind of guys can hire tens of thousands of people to solve that problem. And that's not even that effective as we've seen. When it comes to AI, you have to amass just a bunch of labeled data for each one of these behaviors. And if you're trying to solve something like terrorism or human trafficking, or for the dating apps, underage users, you may not have a lot of data. Even if you're the Match Group or Magic Labs, which owns Badoo and Bumble, they may not even have the right data sets to do this. So it puts a lot of stress on these companies to figure this stuff out.
So I totally agree. I think, it's very context dependent. I don't think it's realistic to expect like one general policy that's gonna govern every platform, because it's not, we wouldn't want that, and it's not appropriate. I do think what's kind of missing, like I think you were talking about getting individuals, to be responsible and own kind of the content. I think we do need to incentivize companies and platforms as well to make sure that they are tracking and making those, decisions to make sure that we're improving that, the environments that people, because the environments fosters the way that people behave, right? And I think right now that component is sometimes missing. Like, yes, when there's like that tech backlash and people are incentivized to do that, but we can't wait for that to happen, right? We should figure out how we can incentivize companies.
The other option is do nothing, as we've kind of been doing. And the problem with that is if you rely on the community itself to self-moderate, it's not really that effective. And the main reason it's not effective is a lot of people don't use the reporting features that are even there. I think 18% of people actually report cases, and that's the stat we've seen across pretty much every vertical. So that means 80% of people out there aren't aren't reporting folks, and that's a problem. You don't see this in the real world. You see, if you go to New York on the subway lines, you'll see the signs that say, if you see something, say something. We just need to do a better job as individuals, helping to self-moderate and self-police a lot of the communities that we want to participate in online.
Yeah, and I think so. Following that, I think in the absence of a global policy, and also with this kind of there's the idea that there shouldn't be a burden on the person who's being harassed or having done hate speech against to self-report, both in the real world or otherwise. What is the burden of accountability on the different platforms when entire groups of people are recipients of harm due to the content on those platforms?
Do you mean legally or morally and ethically?
I think you can answer either.
Yeah, I mean, legally, Section 230 of the CDA basically, indemnifies all of them from having to do anything. It basically means it tries to distinguish between the difference between a media company and a platform. And if you're a platform that facilitates user-generated content, you're legally protected from any content that's distributed through those channels. So, I mean, legally, not a lot. Morally and ethically, I think that's where the question comes out. It's like, where do you draw the line around what behaviors should be allowed and not allowed on your platform? And there's probably some global set of standards that make sense across everything, like illegal activity or human trafficking. I think we could all shake our heads and say, yes, that's probably a bad thing to allow on any platform. But when you get down to harassment and hate speech, it starts to get a little gray. Even though that's a controversial opinion, it starts to infringe upon free speech in that sense. And so a lot of these platforms have to be very careful around the way that they monitor and then take action on a lot of these behaviors.
Yeah, I'd love to hear kind of the opinion on that too in the more localized setting of schools.
Yeah, thinking about my answer. What was the question? No, I think school is like free, like it's still free speech, right? So you have Tinker vs. Des Moines, which guides almost every discipline decision every school makes in America. But then you get this what do you call it, application of that rule, right? So like, oh, it's causing a disruption. Like, no, that was hate speech, right? Or something was said online and it leads to a fight on campus. It's really trying to find, what I think schools are scrambling to find policy and language on how do we respond to this in an appropriate manner. But I also think schools are handcuffed because of privacy laws. You can't go online and say this student did this, or this happened in the school, here's who involved. And that's where it starts to get really dicey of how do you find that balance between teaching the appropriate behavior, teaching how to respond to the appropriate behavior, and then having consequences that fit the crime, so to speak. Right. So how do we hold people accountable in the way that makes sense here, but still like free speech, everything else, like a lot of schools, we talk about like, oh, we don't have a social media policy. We just ban devices. And so we'll see like, blatant disregard of laws where it's like, oh, I just took the phone and searched it. Like, yeah, you can't really do that. And they're like, oh, well, our kids will let us do it. And I'm like, that's fine. Like, if you want to do that and that's your policy, great. Do you want to be the first lawsuit before the Supreme Court? Like, that's the direction where we're going. And there hasn't been a lot of case law to really guide that. So schools are kind of, I think, winging it, which is not a good thing because there's just not enough information to really tell them what they can do under what the letter of the law.
Right. And I think something that we dealt with when we were trying to determine ethical guidelines is ultimately that it couldn't be worldwide, and that we also had to avoid colonizing, and you're using kind of the same mentality that we had created tech with to also create ethics and deploy them around the world. So coming to that, in terms of content moderation or what free speech is, should the majority decide? And how do we protect traditionally oppressed and silenced groups of people? And that can be interpreted as broadly as how do we protect the people being bullied? How do we protect people that maybe don't have access to the same AI tools, or people that have had things like genocide committed against them?
So I think the upvoting and is a very it's a very Western and popular way. It's like mimics our ideals of democracy and kind of the popular kind of vote. I personally have a bit of a controversial perspective in the sense that I don't think every vote is equal, and I do think that there is this notion of experts and of course it's context dependence, and those votes should matter more, those opinions should matter more, and it's okay. I think sometimes we get paralyzed to make tough decisions, and I think we need to turn to people that are experts in their domains to kind of help guide us. but also realize that, we're not always going to have the right solutions, but, we should try, we should experiment.
Do you think there should, or that experts could also include people coming from maybe groups that wouldn't be traditionally considered experts, but have been most adversely affected?
I think like that's, you want to make sure that, diversity, that the minority is not silenced, that you don't end up with just like echo chambers of just, people living, right? You want, of course, that diversity. And I think that is definitely, important to bring different perspectives and different training, you know what I mean, to the table. So picking your experts is important for sure.
Interesting. I want to ask a fun question a little bit after that. Yes, please. Yeah.
So, and kind of a couple things along that line in terms of like, I generally I don't trust the popular vote. And the only reason I say that, like, we've had enough moral panics in the past few years. Like if you remember the Blue Whale Challenge, or there's the one my daughter got last year, and not FOMO, like that weird looking creature from the Japanese Horror Museum. And next thing you know, my daughter's coming home like, oh, like you're supposed to talk to me about this thing. And I'm just like, I knew it was fake, but it was enough information where my entire school district felt the need to send home a letter. And so you kind of see like these moral panics and stuff come up. So it's having the right experts. I think the more we can train people to be their own experts and how to investigate media literacy, digital literacy. One of my favorites to talk about underrepresented groups or potential genocides. Susan Benish talks about counter speech, like how can we train people to speak up in a way to get people thinking about their words and their language and what they're saying to kind of sort of pivot them around. We've seen that time and again, particularly through platforms like Twitter, where just in a basic conversation, people are able to shift their mindset and prevent some really bad things from happening just through casual conversation.
Yeah, just one comment on that. I think this is one area where I think Twitter and Facebook actually have made some investment and do really well, even though for some reason it doesn't get evangelized, is the difference between trust and safety and content moderation with content quality. It's a really hard problem, especially in this world of personalization and content recommendation. How do you, if you want to follow certain journalists or certain people and organizations and institutions and get that content, how do you then cycle in other people's opinions in a way that educates folks in the right way? And it's just a phenomenally hard problem to solve.
Yeah, I want to reference an article we talked about, or at least read together, was that free speech is not the same as freedom of speech. And so kind of address the idea that some of the platforms that we're using to share content and memories with each other or information were not built for us. They were built for advertisers and other people. With that in mind, things like upvoting or public opinion can be manipulated. One of my favorite artists, Lizzo, who likes Lizzo? Awesome. Well, so I think it was a few weeks ago or a few months ago, she had kind of a play party, which everybody played her song at the same time. This drove it to #1. Is this a violation in some way of trust or free speech? This is not about a particular content, but the way that we promote content on the platforms. What do y'all think?
I don't think so. I mean, it's kind of because they're playing within the rules of the system, right? So if it's a watch party, we've seen one of my favorite people to follow on social media is a guy by the name of Brian Brushwood. He's done like Scam School and other stuff, and it's just based out of Texas, and it's all about different kind of bar scams and stuff over the years and how we get fooled. And he did one where at the peak of 50 Shades of Grey, he and his friend made a fake book. He said, we want to see, like, let's kind of do an experiment. So they did a fake cover, made up the name of an author, crowdsourced the entire book, and had people put in their own words and then put it in iTunes. And within a day, they had it as the #1 selling book in romance. And the whole goal was like, we kind of want to let them know that this system is a little messed up. And so they just trying to game the system and educate people like, this is the kind of stuff you can do. Like, how do we fix this? And so I think when the rules are set, like playing within those rules, like I don't see anything specific wrong with that. That's just been my experience.
No, I'd agree with that. I think, as long as, you're playing within the rules. Now, I think there are times where we should be questioning the rules, right? I think different, countries have different kind of rules around like campaigning and, what you're allowed to do. Like for me, this is just an example of campaigning, right? And so I think that's kind of where the conversation's at, is like, what should we be doing in terms of kind of the rules and policies to govern these?
At the risk of going off the rails here and taking this discussion on a different track. That seems like a benign example when you're talking about like entertainment.
It was intentional.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, but when you start talking about the ability for the internet to be used as a tool to shape human thought and public opinion in a way that we've never seen before, upvoting for entertainment purposes, that's one thing. If you're upvoting to shape policy or the way that people view certain political candidates on either side, that's where it gets really dangerous. But how do you distinguish between the two and monitor for that? It's hard.
Coming to that, so I think it was Cloudflare that deplatformed 8chan after the El Paso shootings. As content experts and people working in the system, do you all view deplatforming as an acceptable form of content moderation, or does it violate free speech?
Man, this is dicey.
Sorry, I didn't.
I'm not an expert in that. I would say that you look at what it's done to Milo and how he's been struggling to make ends meet, but you look at some of the content that he was distributing, and there's an argument I think against or for deplatforming someone like that that's clearly trying to cause issues. For something like 8chan, I thought it was a really thoughtful approach that Cloudflare took to that. And Matthews, the CEO's letter, had a pretty good explanation as to the logic behind why they made that decision. As it relates to those types of environments, I think in general these aren't necessary public utilities or public spaces for the most part. These are private companies that have to make decisions around what they want to allow and not allow philosophically, ethically, morally, as a business. And I applaud Cloudflare for the decision they made to, for deplatforming them, knowing that they were just going to go somewhere else immediately and spin up the website again. They didn't need that money, as we've seen from their IPO last week. So it's hard. That again, I keep saying that, but yeah, I mean, these aren't. These spaces are built on private companies, right? And so they get to make their decisions on what they allow.
That being said, what if, for instance, in certain parts of the world, Facebook is the internet? It's the only platform available. So it's a private company, but with a monopoly in certain areas. We can talk about the issue of Myanmar, where it was the source of information, and then also a genocide was caused. What is the responsibility of a private company if they have cornered the market?
I can see the pain in some of your faces of us having to answer that question. Yeah. I just looked down.
So sorry. I've been in ethics for the past 2 years. How many minutes do we have left? We'll lighten it up at the end. I promise.
When you are the arbiter of truth around information flow of any kind, that is a very dangerous position to be in this day and age. So I think they do have some responsibility to not shape that information, but at least approach the right leaders in those areas to work out some solution that makes sense for them. But yeah, being single-threaded like that does put them in a position of power that I think is a unique spot that we haven't seen really ever in the history of humans.
Well, like add to that, give like a concrete example. So one of our partners is Betty Ford, Hazleton Betty Ford, and they had a situation with one of the tech giants when people would search for information related to rehab, right? Finding appropriate rehab centers. And what they found out is the search results were favoring ad results and other stuff. And the algorithm was pointing people to unaccredited rehab institutions. So you get a lot of relapse, you get poor therapy and other stuff. And so what Betty Ford was pushing for is, can we get something in the algorithm that you created in this search for this piece to really direct people to vetted, accredited institutions that can provide the appropriate medical resource. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for liability. And like, can we do something about that? And they made the adjustment, and now that's working. So I think those are good examples of how, if you're the source, directing people to the right information. I think there's a huge ethical value there.
Yeah, and I think that also gives us an opportunity. And I know there's a sign here telling us how many minutes are left. What is it? I don't even know. To pivot into solutions, and that way we end on a more positive note. In your particular field, what are the solutions that you've seen? You've mentioned one. I think I'd like to give you the opportunity to also talk about different ways you're arming or inoculating children online and how that can have far-reaching effects into adulthood. Also acknowledging that, at least here, I assume you're doing it in the States, we have an incredible access to a diversity of platforms and tools and resources at our disposal. Oh, great. Okay.
Perfect. I can fill that. That's good. Yeah, no, for us, just lost my thought. It's really, yes, no, I got that part. I got like 4 of them. One is, how to respond to all this stuff. I think it's still so new. We're looking about technology that's 10 years old. So I remember when I first started teaching, we had the first phones with keyboards. Remember like the Motorola Envy and those, like you'd slide it up, be like, I got a keyboard. I'm not pushing 3, like you push the number 3 times, you get the letter F, like no more. And as you walk, like kids are weird. Like you walk by them and they're like the yawn stretch, like trying to look in their pocket or looking for a pencil 5 times in one class, or, going in their backpack, or the really weird ones, like their hands under their desk, and you walk by. You're like, what are you doing? Like no one should stare at your crotch that long and being like normally adjusted for society. And you walk by, they'll take their phone and slide it under their butt. And it's like, it's going to be next to your face in like 20 minutes, right? And some of you laugh because you do that while you're driving. But anyway, the whole idea was I called my dad up, and my dad started teaching in 1967. And I asked him, I was frustrated, like all these phones are everywhere. I asked him, what's going on? He starts laughing on the phone. I'm like, why are you laughing? And he's like, I just can't believe kids are still doing that. And I'm like, doing what? He's like, just getting away with stuff. This is a global issue for sure, but I think the US is unique because we're the largest country with this level of like tech accessibility, right? If you look at all the states, like the UK has great programs. The UK is smaller than California population wise. Australia has great programs. They're smaller than Texas. So as you start to roll out, not only at a state level, at a national level or a global level, these are huge problems that take a lot of people having these kind of conversations. And then you just kind of see the difficulty when you get into policy and everything else that goes with that. So our stuff is really about training them not only how to respond to the negativity, how to build positive social media campaigns, right? Hit them when they're young, show them how to use the platforms. How does a professional use it? That's the importance of having teachers and having devices integrated in the classroom so we can model and guide that behavior when they'll listen to us. Like if you have a teenager, like there's like, Mark Twain had the line, the older I get, the smarter my parents become. You just hit a certain age where you just tune them out. And so the more we can do to hit them when they're young and create that appropriate behavior when they get to an age, they kind of know what to do when they're like, oh, you don't know anything, you're my parent.
Can I follow up and just ask a quick question in terms of kind of with children and teenagers, teaching them how to moderate or control negativity? What if that negative sentiment is actually criticizing, for instance, a government structure? How do you like kind of tease apart what is negative like bullying and what is negative like again challenging an injustice in the world?
It's the art of disagreeing, right? So like what I see is if someone comes on there, I'll use like a sports analogy. Like my friend will post on there like, oh, I love the Raiders, they're amazing, and then his friend respond like, you suck, right? Like that would be not really constructive negative speech. But to have something where it's like, oh, I believe in this candidate, or I believe in this platform, I believe in this policy, or save the whales, whatever it is, if I could disagree with that, I don't know why you disagree with saving the whales, but if I were to disagree with that, how do I do that in a way that is more conversational and less accusational? And I think that's what we're seeing is everything is so divisive, where it's not only that I disagree with you, but I disagree with you so vehemently that I'm not even going to acknowledge you. We're just going to break down into name calling. An even more concrete example, my 5-year-old and my 9-year-old. Like there is no disagreeing there. It's usually someone's getting hit within 5 seconds and then everyone's in timeouts and then we got to sort it out through the tears. That same type of behavior, like training kids, like how do you disagree? How do you have these conversations? How do you engage at those higher levels and be able to answer those questions? We had a situation up in Portland at their state legislature. Last year, we had 4 students go before a senatorial committee and advocate for mental health days. And they sat before, these senators at this committee to move the bill forward for a vote. And we trained them on how to present the policy. I mean, these are high school kids, how to present the policy, advocating. They did a Q&A. And one of the questions came up, well, you're kids, you guys kind of lie all the time. Aren't you going to, lie and take a mental health day? And really, you just want a day off. And he was great. He's like, we're lying now. We're taking sick days that we need as mental health days, but we're having to lie about it because we can't get the excused absence. So you're setting us up to fail and putting us in a position where we have to lie in order to protect our own mental health. and like is doing like air fives in the air and just like, you get them. Because so again, knowing how to respond, knowing what to say, when to say it, and the way to say it, I think is just a huge learning piece that has somehow dropped off somewhere.
To expand on that, key phrase we use a lot is context matters. So let me give you an example. So let's say I send the same 10 messages to these 3 folks here, and on the 10th message to each of them, same messages, the 10th one, I send a sexual message to all 3 of them. Mo, she responds back with a sexual response. Matt basically disengages completely. And then Z here has a negative or fear, some sort of toxicity in her response. In the first example, the positive sexual response, how many of you guys here think that's sexual harassment? Ooh, Renee, thank you. And then the second example, disengagement. So no response, just completely, it doesn't matter what platform I'm on, forget dating apps, just anywhere. In the second example, disengagement completely, no response. Is that sexual harassment? Show of hands. So, okay. And then the third example, a negative response is everybody. Show of hands, I'm sure. Fantastic. Huh? Yeah. So it's like I teed this up for you. Thank you. So this highlights and illustrates why this problem, before you even get to the data and the technology and the moderators, the biases and all those things, this is why this is a phenomenally difficult problem to solve, because we work with one of the largest dating app out there, and they struggled trying to understand, how do we define sexual harassment? And they looked at all 3 of these examples and many other use cases, and they are still struggling to come up with a definition, because if you label too many of these things as sexual harassment, then what it does is the systems themselves will then start to flag these behaviors and flood their internal cues and moderation cues with all sorts of false positives, and that's not really helpful. So in the third example, or in the first example, the positive sexual response, usually I don't have a response, but I usually add additional context to that says, if this was me sending a note to one of my internal employees, is that then sexual harassment? And then the answer is, yeah, well, I'm in a position of power, right? So that obviously changes the context. And this illustrates why this problem is so hard for moderators, who a lot of times are internationally based, especially when they're dealing with English translations. It's why systems, it's really hard for them to figure out when a complex behavior like sexual harassment or human trafficking or terrorism is present. And give you another analogy, we as humans, when we communicate with one another, we use words, all sorts of signals. We're also looking at your eye contact. I wave my hands a lot, so I'd probably be waving my hands at you in some manner. You look at body language, tone of voice, all those things add context to the words. You can say the same 10 things to 10 different people, but because of the way you act and communicate that message, it's going to have a very different impact on that individual. Now imagine machines trying to look through messages and trying to sniff out, is this thing hate speech? Well, it can't look at a single word to detect that. It actually can't even look at multiple sentences. It has to look at a whole bunch of context around user history and what platform am I on? What community is this? What's the historical context of interactions between these 2 users? And that's why it's taking so long for these AI systems to basically get trained in a way that can detect this stuff. And the evolution on the solution side has been, it started off with something called dictionaries, which are basically blacklists and whitelists. This is keyword detection. It's been around forever. And you couple that with self-moderation and users reporting other users, which is again only 18%. And that's really ineffective. The last 10 years or so, we've seen something called classifiers. Who knows what a classifier is? The tech crowd. Cool. Classifier is basically you train, let's say oversimplification here, 2 types of data, and you throw it at an algorithm and you say, this is the thing and this is not the thing. That's how all basic AI works at a high level. And there's a lot of these platforms out there that can detect a simple like toxic behavior that's trained off a simple data set. But a lot of times these things miss context. It doesn't include any metadata around the person, the individual, the platform, time zones, gender, age, whatever it might be. And so what you're seeing now as of the last maybe 6 months or so is something called basically aspect models, which are solutions that combine metadata from these systems, combine multiple classifiers, and use an immense amount of data to basically try and define, is this conversation, not just the message and the word, but is this user in this conversation or this thread containing some element of this one of many 40 plus toxic behaviors.
Right. And now that we're talking about machine learning or AI or the algorithms that are being deployed at scale by tech companies, a lot of institutes that combine policy and research, such as the AI Now Institute, have shown that a lot of the algorithms that we deploy actually mimic the biases and inequities of the real world. So when we're talking about things like sexual harassment, we're actually talking about things like, what is the contextualized consent? What is the power and privilege in which this system is being taken? And should AI, as we know it, even be used as a solution for such a complex and potentially harm-causing solution?
So I'll say one thing and I'll quit hogging the mic here. When we first started working with dating apps, I actually thought that they would want some real-time intercept, like we can identify the thing and then either shape the message from the sending user or just prevent that message from even hitting another person, or usually it's women. It's usually dudes sending this stuff to women. And what we found is that wasn't what the dating apps wanted at all. It infringe upon free speech in a way that would completely alienate their user base. Like no user wants to know that they're looking at these things and then shaping conversations in any way. And so you have to let the message actually hit the user on some level and then start to figure out what to do about it. And then it gets into the conversation around consent and harassment.
Right. I mean, these AI systems are being deployed and purchased, I assume, by the platforms themselves. Yes. I mean, I think this brings an interesting kind of discussion. I'll have everybody answer, how does your work and the solutions you provide intersect with the existing power and privilege that kind of exists in this intersection between tech and content moderation and individual ability to express themselves?
I think, for us, one of the hard things is we don't have access to our customers' data, right? And so we don't know what they're using it for. And we're still giving them the tools to build these very powerful models to make these, decisions. So a lot of it is about, training them and making sure that they have the understanding. We have this concept of like citizen developers. It's more about having our citizen data scientists so that you have the tools to be able to assess not only the intended consequences, but also think about the unintended consequences. How can we mitigate it? How can we add diversity in our data? How can we, look through our data and QA it before we even actually train those models?
There you go. To me, it's just really fascinating because I think, especially diversity, access to tech, there's all these little nuanced things, in the populations that we work with. But it's looking at, how our students and young people and young adults are interacting with the different platforms, where they're engaging on these platforms. The age groups that are engaging on these platforms is very diverse across the board. So in our case, we're seeing, dating apps, gaming apps, social media platforms across the board. There's just really diverse levels of engagement. So it's trying to understand all those platforms. How do you report content? How do you respond to content? And more importantly, training them on how to create content. That's where the creativity piece comes in. And it's less about getting kids to understand. And this one situation where I had a girl in class got really upset at another student. And she just tweeted out like, oh, some people think they have all the power. I'm so mad at you. And the person she was talking about saw it. And she's like, why would you say that about me? We could have had a conversation. So I have this 16-year-old sobbing in my classroom because in her mind, she's like, but that's how I felt. And I just feel bad because crying makes me uncomfortable, but that's a whole different issue. And I'm just like, I know that's how you felt. How could we have handled this differently? And really just try to make it a learning experience for her. I think adding to what you said in terms of data and users, what I appreciate is having this kind of access, right? That I can bring students and users and people together. I think that's a big part of it, who are actually using the platform and having a good or bad experience, being able to give feedback and then have something done about it. That is, I've seen it happen. Most of our partners have been very responsive, and it's a beautiful thing when a kid comes up and says, oh, we had this problem, and the platform's like, oh, that's interesting. What do you think we should do about it? And then a year later, you see a product piece come out that actually responds to that. Like that to me is pretty amazing.
That sounds great. I think it's about time, if y'all are okay with opening it up for audience questions. So Cory Doctorow is a sci-fi writer that I really love. And he does a version of the equity stack when asking the audience to ask questions, which is that you alternate between men and women, or men, woman, and non-binary. Considering this is a basically panel about content moderation, I'm in some sense moderating the ability for people to provide and ask questions in content. How do people feel about this? Yes? Okay, great. So we'll have a woman ask the first question. Oh, yeah.
There we go. Thanks for such a great panel. It's been really interesting. One of the things I've noticed from a lot of discussions around content moderation is about companies wanting to make sure that they're not abridging the free speech of their users and kind of taking a more cautious approach to let more speech out there than kind of do the flip side and abridge too much. I guess I'm wondering if there's been studies and lots of commentary on the fact that that can have a negative effect of actually chilling the speech of other users, leading to self-censorship and people not wanting to partake in the discussion online. And if that has come up in your work at all, if that's formed part of any conversation and decision-making around algorithms or just like human decision-making.
In the gaming industry, what they have found is that the stick doesn't really work, especially because you're dealing with very technically savvy users. So if you ban them or infringe upon their ability to talk some junk to another user, they're going to find a way to do it, and they're just going to do it. What has been successful is the carrot, finding ways to reward players for positive behaviors, whether it's through incentives or personalized content or offers or discounts on things like drops. I'm not a gamer myself, but I think that's a word. But yeah, I mean, I think the carrot approach has definitely been more effective. You're just going to alienate the user if you go too aggressive. Now, that being said, being able to, I think a lot of the social platforms of all types have failed is around the evangelism and communication of what is actually their policy. There was a stat earlier that you tweeted about, there's like 72 days it would take you to read every guideline or privacy policy that exists across all the platforms we use. That's crazy. No one's ever going to do that. I've never read a single one of these things. And so no one ever, that's not true. The community guidelines you have to read for what we do. But for the most part, no one's going to read those things. You're kind of self-corrected either by another individual, the community, micro or macro that you interact with. So either your peer group in that game or that app are going to give you more what you want, or they're going to reprimand you, or the platform is going to reward you in some way. But if the platform is the one that's spanking the child or whatever here, pulling out the stick, then it usually isn't as effective. Does that answer your question? Kind of. No real stat there, sorry.
Thank you. I'm curious to get the panel's views, I guess, on the discussion around the business models for the content platforms, essentially which are, driven toward engagement, views, clicks, time, and, the more content, the better. And then as people generate content, they're driven toward content that matches sort of what they generate, what they view, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously this is all very, tied up with the advertising market, and is that reaching saturation, and what are the implications of that on, speech online, essentially, right? Whether there needs to be more barriers for people to actually generate content, whether that's paying them to generate it or charging them a fee to generate it, looking at the other perspective. But anyway, curious to get the panelists' thoughts on that.
I'll take this one real quick, and then you guys. Yeah.
No, I'm fascinated by that. Like talking to young people, one of the social platforms that they're on, I can tell you they hate advertising. They don't engage in the advertising. They want nothing to do with the advertising. I'm very curious, like Instagram made an announcement last week. I'm very curious to see how that impacts engagement. I think to add a qualifier to your question, I think it like good content drives engagement, right? So it's not necessarily more content, but it's good content and where and how people are engaging on that. In terms of ad revenue, I feel that with the safety by design conversation, this is just what I'm observing. I think there's more thought being put into the user on the end that would not have been the case 10 years ago. But I also feel that they have to make money or they don't exist. There's a great, one of my friends who's a media literacy professor over in New York. Every year she does the same question, and I don't think she's alone, but it's like, who in here, if you could pay $20 a year to use Facebook, who would do it? No one raises their hand, right? So I think we've kind of, what do you call it? Let the devil in with the breeze kind of thing, right? Like we know we want this platform, we want to use it. And I think we're all kind of setting up our own personal rules for how we're willing to engage on these platforms, what we're willing to allow and how we're willing to allow it. And there I've caught myself like seeing ads and other stuff. There's like these weird ethical dilemmas that I'm like, wait, like, do I want to be on here? Do I like that? Like, Facebook should not know I like Bill Murray as much as I do. Why do you keep trying to sell me his shirts? Like, that's the kind of stuff I'm just like, okay, like what am I comfortable with?
I do think I would like to see companies being incentivized to care about some of these other, more than just the bottom line, right? Of just like, they're tracking clicks, they're tracking usage. There should be other considerations as well. We've kind of been talking about it a little bit before, but it's like, those are not the only metrics that matter. And we need to move to a stage where, we start thinking about, what are our goals around content moderation? How do we track it? How do we actually have, we can run experiments and iterate and, do this in a very systematic way and make sure that it is something that is a higher priority. And it's not because, we're getting bad PR or because, but really because we care and we need to do this because it's the right thing to do.
I think adding to that was brilliant. One of my favorite stats, if you look at accountability reports, is the new one is looking at trust in the platform, right? So user trust, I think, is a great metric. That everything that you just said.
And I think people care a lot, more and more, right? As we have access to information, as we, start thinking and having these conversations, we are making, purchase decisions or making some, thinking about these ethical implications of the actions that we're, taking, even in our consumers' behavior or just, leisurely behavior, whatever it may be. So I'm hoping that's kind of where we're going to be going.
I agree with you guys, but there's two ways to impact a company like that's bottom line. One is either through the attrition of users because they just fed up with it and go somewhere else, or bring it full circle to the beginning of the conversation. It's infractions in policy. So, if there is some change to the way that these companies get penalized for nefarious behaviors on the platform, then that'll help shape it. But for now, they have for better or worse, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders and to their board to maximize shareholder value, and that means engagement of all types, right? And that's kind of the pickle that we've put ourselves in. I spent the last 12 years in data for advertising and MarTech, so I unfortunately know that space well.
We're getting the hook. So does everybody remember those from old movies? They just pulled you off. All right. Thank you for letting us know and having us here in Thoughtworks. And I'm sure you can come up to anybody here or find them on Twitter and chat more about this. So, yeah.